Good evening and welcome to Notre Dame University London Global Gateway. And welcome to the final session of the second module of the Master of Arts degree in Catholic Social Teaching, the module entitled Catholic Social Teaching Applied. Some of you were here a few months ago for another public lecture with John Bruton, and it's great to be able to finish the year, the first year of the full MA programme with this public lecture this evening. This is also a promotional evening for our various master's programmes in theology at St Mary's, in theology itself, in Christian spirituality and bioethics and medical law, as well as Catholic social teaching. And there's literature about those degrees at the back of this hall. When we began the gestation of the Master of Arts in Catholic social teaching in 2015, those of us involved thought that there could never have been a better possible time to launch such a degree. I don't think we really knew what this country would be like 4 years later, but it's even more true now. And the way in which this degree has grown has been a tremendous gift of God, really, in our university. And I'd like to pay tribute to Francis Campbell and the support that he's given to this degree in particular, as he is due to leave St Mary's, sadly, next year. In the early days when we were planning the degree, another key player was Mary McAleese when she was resident as a visiting professor at St Mary's in those early months, and she gave a lot of support behind the scenes. So it's tremendous to be able to welcome her this evening. Now I ask Monsignor Rod Strange, Professor of Catholic Theology at St Mary's, to welcome Mary. Rod.
Thank you. Ashley, thank you, and good evening, everyone. And just a brief word of welcome to Professor Mary McAleese, who probably doesn't really need to be introduced to anyone, but my first memory of meeting Mary was this is one of the right hands of which she must have shaken thousands upon thousands in her years as President of Ireland. But when she came back to Rome, and I was there as the rector of the Beda College at the time, and which is a college for older men preparing for priesthood from the English-speaking world, and I invited Mary to come one evening when there was when some of the men were receiving a ministry, which is a stage on the process to ordination, for Mass at 6 and then a dinner at 7:30, and she said to me that she would love to come, but she couldn't come to the Mass because she had to go to a lecture, but could she just come for the dinners? Of course, that was fine. And so there I was at about 5:45 before the Mass, standing on the steps of the college, welcoming people coming in, and there was Mary coming up the steps. And I said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "Well," the lecture was cancelled, so I thought I'd come in any case." And I think actually that stayed with me, that memory, because I think it is little. Many another person might have said, "I've actually got a spare hour here to relax," but not Mary McAleese. She came and she joined us, and it's indicative of, I don't know what we're going to hear tonight, but it's indicative, whatever it is that we're going to hear, of somebody who is well grounded in the reality, in the human experience, in the complexities within which we live, and try to navigate our lives as best we can. So Mary, it's wonderful to be able to welcome you here. Thank you for being with us tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks. Vice Chancellor Francis, Ambassador Adrian, and friends, how are you all? You're actually here, are you? In mind as well as body. Now, at the back, can you hear me? You can, good. If at any stage you're having difficulty, just put up your hand and I'll shout like my mother. So what we're looking at this evening, and it'll be, a bird's eye view, bird travelling fast and at altitude, is Catholic social teaching and human rights, the links, the intersections. Catholic social teaching, just to reprise for those of you who might not know what it means, a term generally used to identify those aspects of Catholic Church laws, teachings, doctrines, practices, perspectives, which deal with issues such as social justice, including fundamental human rights and freedoms, and through which social, economic, or political ideologies, or indeed practices, largely external to the Church, are critiqued in the light of the equality of dignity that the Church believes is conferred on every human being by God. The term, of course, Catholic social teaching, very often is linked specifically to the great encyclical of Leo XIII of 1891, Rerum Novarum, seen in its day and indeed subsequently as marking a watershed in the Church's relationship, particularly with international human rights laws and international human rights discourse, because at that time we wouldn't have been talking about law, we'd have been talking about discourse. Human rights then, the other side of what we're looking at now, though it's not really the other side, but the other aspect, these derive from the natural law. Some of us in this room might refer to that as divine law. Not everybody does, but they arise by virtue of the human person's human nature. And they're based upon recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. That's just a quotation from a UN treaty on the rights of the child. Human rights, they arise naturally, they arise spontaneously, out of the dignity of the innate dignity of the person. They don't rely on any human agency to concede them, or to create them for that matter, precisely because they emanate from the natural law. But they do rely very heavily on human agencies to advocate them, to declare them, to protect them, to vindicate them, to develop them. Because, well, don't need to tell people in this room, there are many, many places all over the world, some not too far from home, where human rights of human beings are denied, or they are ignored, overlooked, or circumscribed. There are many, many international agencies today. We are very privileged in many ways to grow up in a time when there are many international and national human rights laws, and even special international courts designed to promote, to protect, to vindicate human rights. We have many, many agencies, both official and NGOs, whose job it is to protect human rights, to enter into discourse. And they may be specific to a particular area of human rights, or they may be broadly based. None of the, we've this wonderful body now of international declarations and conventions on human rights. None of them claims to be exhaustive of the human rights which they declare or set out. So the absence of a particular right from a human rights treaty doesn't mean, or from a document, doesn't mean that the human right doesn't exist. There are very often what we would call unenumerated rights, embedded. In fact, speaking here this evening about religion and the role of religion in relation to human rights, one of the unenumerated rights in, for example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which acknowledges the right to freedom of religion, in brackets also includes, but doesn't specifically say so, freedom to change religion. So you can have unenumerated rights. The field, so, of human rights is dynamic, it's prone to change, to develop, to move. And it's very often, there are developmental or interpretive changes. They can sometimes happen as a result of legal action, whether in international courts or in national courts, successful campaigning by advocacy groups, or indeed the ongoing work of United Nations treaty bodies. Bodies like, for example, the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, known as CERD, C-E-R-D for short, the Committee Against Torture, known as CAT, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the CRC, and I'm mentioning those three treaties in particular, though there are many, many more international UN treaties that protect human rights, but I mentioned those three specifically. Why? Because the Holy See is a state party to those conventions or treaties. In other words, it voluntarily ratified them, and in ratifying them, it becomes a state party, and state parties are then obliged to implement the principles set out in those treaties within their jurisdiction. So, as you probably already know, the Catholic Church is the only faith system in the world to have permanent representative status at the United Nations. And indeed, it is the only faith system in the world to be a state party to any human rights treaty, and in particular, of course, in the case of the Holy See, to these 3 treaties. Importantly, the Holy See was instrumental, as were a number of very prominent Catholics, but the Holy See itself was instrumental in bringing about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And that is the huge watershed, the big heft of the latter part of the 20th century behind human rights discourse. The Holy See, I'll come back to that in a moment, it was instrumental in bringing that about, strongly supported it. It was deeply involved in drafting the travaux preparatoires for the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was promulgated by the United Nations in 1989. And indeed, importantly, it was one of the first state parties to ratify that convention. It was the 4th state party to do so. And also worth reminding ourselves that the Convention on the Rights of the Child was an initiative driven by a very prominent Belgian Catholic priest, Canon Joseph Moorman. He would have been regarded very much as the father of children's rights. So this lecture is going to look kind of very briefly and rather briskly maybe at the interaction between Catholic social teaching and human rights discourse, both in the global secular sphere, but also in the internal church sphere. By internal, I mean within its own laws and teachings, within canon law and within doctrine. So there'll be a very brief backward glance to the centuries before Rerum Novarum, but mainly there'll be an emphasis on the century after Rerum Novarum, and the century and a quarter really since Rerum Novarum. Now there are 2 spheres to look out for here. The internal church sphere, which I just mentioned, where the church's magisterium speaks to its own members, of which there are 1.2 billion worldwide, and speaks to its members about their rights and their obligations as members of the church. And there's the external sphere, where the church, as a global moral force, to use an expression, I think, was it from Kofi Annan, who talked about the pulpit of the world when he was referring to John Paul's visit to the United Nations. I think it was Kofi Annan came up with that expression, that he was now speaking from the pulpit of the world. So where the church, there's the external sphere where the church talks out to the world in general about rights and obligations that accrue to the individual human person, or indeed to groups, but it speaks to institutions and it speaks to governments, and it also speaks to the human person. Most, and I think this is an important point, most of the church's commentaries on issues concerning social justice and Catholic social teaching then are addressed to the world at large and not exclusively to the Catholic faithful. It's important to remember too that, as a very eminent professor of canon law, James Corrigan, noted, fundamental human rights are not lost, he says, by a person's baptism in the church. They remain, and many are explicitly acknowledged by the church. The truth is, though, others are not explicitly acknowledged by the church, and some are even contradicted by church teaching or constrained by canon law. For the integration into church doctrine, practice, and particularly canon law of the human rights due to Catholics as church members and as human persons, this is an area of contemporary dispute in which the magisterium of the church appeals to the divine salvific nature of the church to insist that concepts that are drawn from the secular world of human rights, where people resort to litigation, that these are not appropriate in the realm of a spiritual institution. The late Cardinal Castillo Lara, who was a very influential canon lawyer in his day and still is, even though he's gone to his eternal reward, he explained the Church's thinking on the role of individual autonomous rights. He says this: "The basic attitude of the faithful is not that of vindicating rights, but of living in a communion that views all members of a body with a variety of roles and functions, everyone closely united by a life-giving charity. Freedom conceived as an inviolable autonomous space is not a characteristic or fundamental Christian value. The Christian is placed before God in a fundamental relationship of filial obedience." Now, that view still is a very strong leitmotif of the current Code of Canon Law that was promulgated in 1983. It allows the Church to advocate for certain human rights in global debates while simultaneously imposing restrictions on those same rights internally within the Church's own rules on the rights and obligations of Church membership. In the external sphere, the voice of Pope Francis has been really very strong in defence of social justice, particularly excoriating the injustice of poverty, the failure to honour the dignity and equality of migrants, arguing for social inclusion of the marginalised, developing social justice discourse to embrace the issue of climate change, challenging the Christian credentials of extreme forms of nationalism, particularly those that would erect barriers to keep out economic migrants or political refugees, criticising economic systems, structures and institutions that prioritise profit over people, as well, of course, as standing firm in opposition to abortion laws, to same-sex marriage laws, laws limiting family size, the use of condoms to prevent the spread of HIV/AIDS. Only last week, the Pan American Judges Summit on Social Justice, which was held in the Vatican, was addressed by Francis, and he spoke in very tough, uncompromising terms of the unacceptability of economic and social policies that lead to the acceptance and justification of inequality and indignity, injustice and lack of tangible opportunities that generate violence. He concluded there's no democracy with hunger, there's no development with poverty, nor justice in inequality. Now, words like that have caused him to be regarded, even by some within the Church, as, to use some of the expressions that have been used of him, a dangerous socialist, a communist radical. Yet anybody who knows Catholic social teaching will know that these words could be taken straight from Rerum Novarum, could be taken straight from Quadragesimo Anno, the 40-year celebration, or indeed the 100th year celebration of Rerum Novarum, where Rerum Novarum's views are reiterated generation after generation. His words are firmly in that tradition of talking to the world about the primacy of the human person's place of dignity and equality, particularly within the sphere of economic affairs. Pius XI's words in Quadragesimo Anno, which in 1931 celebrated the 40th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, they were just as strong, every bit as strong as Francis's words in defence of the poor, in condemning economic inequality, declaring, in the words of Pius XI, so enormous and unjust an inequality in the distribution of this world's goods. And he says that it did not truly conform to the design of an all-wise creator. Franklin D. Roosevelt, author of the famous 1930s American New Deal, he referred to Quadragesimo Anno as a radical document and one of the greatest documents of modern times. Many of you who will know the work of Father John Ryan will know how influential he was in the New Deal itself. he helped to form Roosevelt's thinking. And in fact, the first time ever that a Catholic priest gave the invocation at a US presidential inauguration, it was Father John Ryan who did that, thanks to the huge regard in which he was held by Roosevelt. In 1941, coming out of that exactly same tradition and line, the National Catholic Welfare Conference, which today we call it's the Conference of the United States Bishops today, the Episcopal Conference of the United States, it wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt back in 1941, encouraging her to promote human rights, to develop what would become the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that echoed a call made on June the 1st of that same year by Pius XII at Pentecost. He talked about calling the world to safeguard the inviolable rights of the human person and to facilitate the fulfillment of his duties. That's the principal duty, he says, of every public authority. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was put together and pulled together in response to, at the very least in part, in response to those calls. They were highly influential. In 1944, Pius XII encouraged world leaders who were trying then to establish what would become a year later the United Nations. And he asked them to determine the fundamental rights and obligations on which should be constituted a community of states, to chart the way towards a better future, more secure, more worthy of humanity. And we know that the background to that, to egregious world wars, had promoted a new way of looking at the human person and at the need for international safeguards and platforms of safeguard. But even then, the scene was shifting away from workers' rights and economic rights with their strong underpinning of welfare paternalism, where the church had developed a reasoned platform with which it was largely comfortable. It was moving now towards a much broader canvas of inviolable human rights and obligations. These would help secure peace between nations, but in the process, they would begin to develop thinking along a much broader swathe of individual autonomous human rights and fundamental freedoms. And these would put the church well outside of its historic comfort zone, because in shifting agency from paternalistic systems to personal autonomy, and from rights that were merely declared, as was the case with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It had no legal validity, it was merely a persuasive moral document. So moving from rights merely declared to rights with systems built in for their vindication, that new culture, which is still in the throes of being, of forming, it's probably still in its relatively opening chapters, they would eventually involve the church in debates on women's rights, reproductive rights, sex education, HIV prevention rights, abortion rights, LGBTI rights, parental rights, children's rights, the rights of every individual, including children, to freedom of conscience, opinion, belief, religion, freedom to change religion. So the landscape changed quite dramatically in the latter part of the 20th century, opening up huge new areas of discourse. On many of these issues, the church would find itself at the very least out of step with, and indeed often in conflict with, developing perspectives, particularly in the Western world with its much vaunted Christian heritage, and indeed it would find itself in conflict even with some of its own members. The growing momentum behind and the rapid development of human rights discourse is one of the most salient characteristics of the latter part of the 20th century. It began, as we know, in response to the sheer wanton wastefulness of war in the earlier part of that century. And in the immediate aftermath of the worst war in human history, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights set out for the first time in that same human history a body of human rights that no government was entitled to withhold from an individual. And they applied to all persons, regardless of differentiating factors such as race, gender, religion, and they were generally supported by the Holy See, despite certainly there was disappointment that the rights of the unborn were not specifically included. Among those rights, I mean, there are obvious ones, there's a string of them set out over 27 articles: freedom and equality, the right not to be discriminated against, the right to life and liberty, a ban on slavery and torture. You can see the Church's social teaching is, certainly from Rerum Novarum onwards, very much in tune with these. The right to recognition as a person before the law, the right to equality before the law, the right to a remedy for rights violations, a ban on arbitrary detention, the right to fair and public hearing before the law, the presumption of innocence, the right to privacy, to freedom of movement, to asylum, to a nationality, to marry and to found a family, to own property. And then these ones that are more difficult for the Church: the right to freedom of thought and religion, the right to freedom of opinion and expression, the right to freedom of assembly and association, the right to take part in government, to social security, to work, to rest, the right to an adequate standard of living, special protection for motherhood and childhood, the same right to social protection for the legitimate as well as the illegitimate child, the right to education, the prior right of parents to choose their child's form of education, the right to participate in cultural life and to protection of intellectual property, and the right overall to a social and international order capable of realising all those rights. As I said, it's not a binding treaty. It was designed to be a declaratory statement of moral force. Catholic apologist Professor Mary Ann Glendon, who once had a role not unlike your own, Francis, when you were ambassador to the Holy See. She was the US ambassador once upon a time to the Holy See. She describes the Declaration as the single most important reference point for cross-cultural discussion of human freedom and dignity in the world today. Pope John Paul said, "It is one of the most valuable and significant documents in the history of law." Pope John the 23rd, though, was really absolutely crucial here, because he seemed to understand, since he had just lived through it, that this post-war juncture was a crossroads for humanity and also for the Church. And he was very anxious that the Church would intuit and deal with the signs of the times, because these were the signs of changing times. And he launched a remarkable, but honestly, really seriously overlooked encyclical, probably the most important encyclical of the 20th century, Pacem in Terris, 1963. It was intended as a springboard for the Second Vatican Council. It was really the agenda for the Council, you could say. And according to a professor of Catholic Studies at Tulsa, Russell Hittinger, Pacem in Terris was a kind of Magna Carta of the Catholic Church's position on human rights and natural law. It was to be not just an open letter to the world, which you would expect from papal encyclicals, but to the recently convened council in Rome. And he goes on to say that the council then, as a consequence, linked the full gamut of human rights with the very core of Christian faith and transformed the Church into one of the world's leading advocates for human rights and democracy. Pacem in Terris identified some 25 inalienable human rights, which arise, again, by virtue of being human. They come from God. And they draw their authoritative force from the natural law, from the God that the Church believes in. And they include the right to life, the right to bodily integrity, the right to means necessary for proper development of life, the right to security, to respect for your person, your reputation, the right to freedom in seeking the truth, the right to freedom of expression and opinion, the freedom to pursue art within the limits of morality and the common good, a little bit old-fashioned perhaps nowadays, The right to truthful information about public events, definitely very topical. We would call that the right not to be overwhelmed by fake news. The right to share in the benefits of culture, the right to basic education and technical training, the right to worship God in accordance with one's conscience, the right to freely choose your state in life, including the right to follow a vocation or found a family, the prior right of parents to support and educate their children, the right to free initiative in the economic sphere, the right to work, the right to satisfactory work conditions, the right to carry on economic activities to the degree of responsibility that a person is capable of, the right to a just wage. We can hear, again, rerum novarum coming through, the right to private property, the right of assembly and association, the right to freedom of movement, the right to emigrate, the right of all, in brackets, including women, to take an active part in public affairs, the right to juridical protection of one's rights. Hittinger says of this that this was not a sudden eruption of rights talk in magisterial documents, but rather it was essentially a repetition of rights already found in St. Paul, the Church Fathers, Aquinas, and other papal encyclicals, in particular Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno. In fact, Hittinger really says that he only recognises two what you might call novel rights appearing in Pacem in Terris. One is, of course, the right of religious conscience, which is unmistakably an effort to develop reflection on this issue, and the second, the rights of women in the contemporary world. And that observation of Hittinger's about these two issues and about the novelty of them is worth noting. For in terms of contemporary human rights, the Church can, I think realistically, certainly in the internal sphere, it can be called a laggard on both subjects when it comes to its own internal jurisdiction of doctrine, teaching, and canon law. An important fact, funnily enough not mentioned by Hittinger, is that much more evident in Pacem in Terris is the influence of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In reality, Pacem in Terris, rather like the Second Vatican Council, which followed it, it never really became the powerful leaven, at least not entirely yet, the powerful leaven that it could have been in terms of developing internal reflection on these significant signs of the times. Instead, the post-conciliar Church became bogged down for 20 years in virtually really the only serious highway of endeavour to come out of the Second Vatican Council, and that was the endeavour that led to the new Code of Canon Law. 20 years from the end of the Council of drafting that new document that was promulgated in 1983 by John Paul II. And like its predecessor, and it can happen not just with the Church's code, but often codified systems that take a long time to draft, run the risk, as has happened with both the 1917 code and the 1983 code, of aspects of it being obsolete before the ink is dry. And then not having enough built-in heft or mechanisms for regular updating. And that certainly completely grounded and overwhelmed the 1917 Code of Canon Law, and is to some extent also in danger of doing the same to the 1983 Code of Canon Law. The debates among the drafters on the rights of the faithful, those who were drafting the code, they're indicative of a church that was not ready and certainly was not then equipped to meet certain issues to do with human rights head on, particularly issues to do with freedom of conscience, of opinion, and belief. The timing couldn't have been worse, because during that same drafting process, a huge transformation was happening in the Western world, and often indeed with the help of Catholic educators. Many of us in this room, were the beneficiaries of the massification of free second level education and free third level education. And it was producing a rights literate and also a rights litigating generation, whose skeptical interrogation would create considerable problems for the clerical and curial church castes in unpacking the hidden and the unresolved problems the clerical caste had created for the church, and indeed in pointing up contradictions between the global advocacy and external advocacy of human rights, the advocacy to that global audience, and the reticence to infuse canon law with those same rights. The Church's mixed signals in this regard were noticed by many among Newman's newly arrived educated laity, and indeed among many clerics and teachers and religious and teachers of the sacred sciences. Hollenbach is undoubtedly right in his view that the Second Vatican Council opened the way for a robust church commitment to human rights. But just because the way opens doesn't mean that you wholeheartedly travel down it, or you travel down it at speed. And certainly there are questions about the speed at which one has travelled, or the church may have travelled down that road to human rights commitment. Because one has to qualify Hollenbach's view by looking at how that commitment has played out since. Undoubtedly, it influenced the Holy See to ratify the 3 treaties that I mentioned earlier. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention Against Torture, which it ratified but only on behalf of the Vatican City State, and the other, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In relation to the two treaties on the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, they were ratified by the Holy See on behalf of 2 entities. One, the Vatican City State, which is a tiny little jurisdiction, and the other, the Holy See, which we call the International Holy See, responsible for the governance of the Catholic Church worldwide. I think it's important, really important to say, because it's so often not given any acknowledgement. In ratifying these United Nations treaties, the Holy See clearly placed itself inside the framework and infrastructure of international secular human rights law. It did that voluntarily. It was not forced to do so. These are all voluntary undertakings. As a state party, it voluntarily subscribed to the principles in the treaties, and it undertook to implement those principles within its jurisdiction. More than that, for a body that was historically, for generations, for centuries, insistent that it could not be held accountable to any human forum. Remember the old language of the perfect society. The only person the church was answerable to was the person who commissioned it and missioned it, and that was God himself. So for a body that was historically insistent that it was the perfect society, hermetically sealed from being accountable to any human forum, including courts or governments, secular governments, here was the Holy See voluntarily accepting its state party obligations, which include, to this day, making regular progress reports to the United Nations treaty monitoring bodies. And these are fairly substantial cycles. They are expected now every 5 years that they will enter into a dialogue with these committees. They will explain what they've done in the past 5 years to implement the treaties in their jurisdiction. And the committees, whoever they may be, will applaud them for that which they have done well, and will critique them for that which the committee believes they could do better on. Many countries, even the best of countries, when they appear before the Committee on the Rights of the Child or the CERD, will be told, yes, you've done that right, but here's what you could do better. So the Holy See is no different to any state party. That's the job of these committees. The job of these committees is to monitor but also push for better practice, better procedures, better laws, whatever area of human rights it's in. But these were momentous changes for the Church, and really it is much to the credit of the Holy See that it undertook these obligations. Unfortunately, since undertaking them, and the first of those undertakings goes way back to the 1980s, to the 1960s. Since undertaking them, and in particular, since the interruption and the huge disruption in church discourse around the child sexual abuse scandals and the scandal of episcopal mismanagement, regrettably, there has been a visible change in the Holy See's attitude to its obligations under these treaties. And its most recent interactions with these treaty monitoring bodies shows a very clear swing back to the old Holy See's former protectionism, its resistance to outside scrutiny, and indeed its historic cynicism about autonomous human rights. And just before dealing with that swing back, which I hope to do reasonably briefly, I just want to look at why that might have happened. That swing back is most evident today in the discourse between the Holy See and the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And I just want to briefly look at the context in which the new Code of Canon Law came into being. For despite having the Declaration of Human Rights, despite having Pacem in Terris and conciliar documents to draw on in relation to a new human rights discourse, the truth is that, as Castillo-Lara says, human rights as a theme were fundamentally new to canon law. Those who were drafting the new Code of Canon Law were not versed in secular civil rights. Canon law was not familiar with rights-based language or the notion of the vindication of the rights of the individual. Monsignor John Dolan from the Archdiocese of Dublin, the diocesan chancellor, said that in fact the tendency in the church had always been to subordinate the individual's rights to the institution. And as Castillo-Lara observes, that really up until the beginning of the drafting of the new Code of Canon Law, canonists had shown almost no interest in human rights as an issue for the internal sphere of the church. So Rick Torfs, who's a canon law scholar in Louvain, probably well known to some people here, he claims that human rights as such are a recent phenomenon in the church, and they are absent for the most part in the history of canon law. And one can understand that because for the millennium leading up to 1870, the church was both a secular power and a temporal power. And after the French Revolution in particular, when many of its powers were threatened and its property was threatened, the church took a very hostile view to the idea of the rights of man. Why? Because it saw it as inimical to its secular position. It saw it possibly also as inimical to its spiritual position in the lives of the people. So really up until Rerum Novarum, the church was very hostile to the idea of autonomous human rights. And as we know, after the demise of the Papal States in 1870, and Pius IX famously withdrew to the Vatican, stayed in a memorable huff, waiting for the Papal States to be returned, and then 60 years later it occurred to the then Pope that it was never going to happen, and they did the deal with Mussolini that gave us the Lateran Treaties and gave them the tiny little Vatican City State about the size of a golf club, in which they could, and the Holy See could operate independently. It's a sovereign monarchy, but it was a place from which they could operate with independence, freedom, and a degree of certainty about their security. But the long incubation of what would in time become the Western democracies had already begun. It spelt the end of empires, not just the empire that was the secular empire that was the Catholic Church, but many other empires were also fading away and dwindling at the same time. And those who drafted the new code were educated really in the mindset of the 1917 code. And that code hadn't changed anything. It had just taken, several thousand years, or really from the early Middle Ages, from the development of canon law as a science. It had taken all those laws, shoved them into one big barn, and called it the 1917 code without changing very much. And that was what the canon lawyers were educated in. So those who drafted the new 1983 code came at it really quite handicapped by the mindset in which they had been formed. They were aware, of course, of the debates. And indeed, they tried their best. One has to give them credit because a lot of their time was spent in the Code Commission drafting what they called the Lex Ecclesiae Fundamentalis. This was what was supposed to be, what they hoped would be the equivalent of a secular written constitution that would set out a charter of rights for the church. And it would have the effect of a written constitution. It would be a charter of the members' rights, the members of the church. It would have a subordinate body of laws that were obliged to be consistent with that constitution. And importantly, it would have tribunals for vindication of those rights. Anyway, that whole project ended in tears. The revision of canon law to include, to be, if you like, overarched by that Lex Ecclesiae Fundamentalis, it never happened. The project was abandoned, and I think that gives some clue to the change of culture, moving from a culture that was hostile to human rights to one that was beginning to see how can we deal with them internally. Aspects of the Lex Ecclesiae were actually introjected, to use the phrase that is used, into the code itself. And so you find in the code long lists of rights and obligations of the Christian faithful and the laity. Well, actually, you don't find a long list of rights. You find a very short list of rights and a very long litany of obligations. And those, unfortunately, novel though they are, and welcome though some of that development is, they show almost no significant nod in the direction of recognising that church members enjoy the fundamental freedoms that were set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to freedom of conscience, belief, opinion and religion. The old obligations based on quiet obedience to the magisterium remain largely intact. Novel but heavily circumscribed is the right of the faithful to make their opinions known on matters which pertain to the good of the church, but they're obliged to do so without prejudice to the integrity of faith and morals, with reverence towards their pastors, attentive to common advantage and the dignity of persons. Teachers of sacred sciences are entitled to express their opinions, but they must do so prudently and observe submission due to the magisterium. So, most telling of all, I think, is the maintenance of the old punishable canons on offences, the offences of heresy, apostasy and schism, because all of these, to one extent or another, trammel on freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, freedom to change religion. In particular, the canons which insist on infant baptism, they remain, and they're very interesting because they have two, some people would argue, are they distinct, but they have two sets of consequences that are intertwined. There is the theological, what I'll call the gratuitous consequences, which are incorporation. These come from the gift of Christ and his sacrifice. These are a gift from God. They are what we would call grace, and they are incorporation into the body of Christ. They are the expunging of original sin, and therefore the opening of the possibility of salvation, eternal salvation. And so that's on the theological side. The juridic side is much more prosaic, and it's debatable whether, in my view, these things now need to be really disentangled to some extent, because they also, at baptism, on baptism, we are, those of us in this room who are Catholic, we were automatically enrolled for life into the Catholic Church. Now that's fine if you're 25 and you know what the obligations of membership are, but the Catholic Church's normative infant baptism does present problems, because the fact that these juridic consequences are imposed on non-sentient infants without their consent and without their comprehension, and without any later formal opportunity to validate or to repudiate, seems not to have raised any significant qualms among our sacred pastors in relation to the churches and the Holy See's acceptance, both in the Universal Declaration and in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, of the right of the human person to freedom of conscience, belief, opinion and religion. The Conciliar Declaration on Religious Liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, is often raised in this regard. Peter Hepplethwaite, I think, called it John the 23rd's last will and testament. He says that Dignitatis Humanae came out of Pacem in Terris. Regrettably, what has happened with Dignitatis Humanae is that if you look at the language of it, it's very carefully phrased. It says that nobody can be forced to embrace the faith. So you would say, well, then how come you can take an infant at 2 weeks and say that that child has embraced the faith? Well, in fact, we do, because Dignitatis Humanae is regarded as applying to the churches, to the external sphere, not the internal sphere. So when it says you can't be forced to embrace the faith, it is talking about people who are not Catholics. They cannot be forced to embrace it. Those who are already Catholics, including the 2-week-old baby who's been baptized, they have already been presumed irrebuttably to have embraced the faith, and they are now obliged to profess it. Now, I think these are the kinds of things that will be open to public discourse in the future. They will be certainly explored. They haven't been really seriously explored by the magisterium at all. It's really pretty much a clear case of the church hanging it both ways. It's likely to trip up the church in the future, particularly in its discourse with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, because the Committee on the Rights of the Child is currently exploring ways of not as much expanding, but explaining adolescent rights. It hasn't really got into this too much, but it's going into this space in the future. So the church's self-ideation is of a church that is a great human rights defender. Those of you who have read Evangelii Gaudium, the first apostolic exhortation of Francis, he referenced the church very strongly as a human rights defender. Again and again, he says, the church acts as a mediator in finding solutions to problems affecting peace, social harmony, the land, the defense of life, human and civil rights. But this is the church again, in the space where it's comfortable, speaking from the pulpit out to the world. But Father Joseph Komonchak, also a noted expert in Vatican II, he points out a fundamental problem here, that it's clear, he says, the church is still trying to come to terms with the notion of rights, first elaborated outside the church, and the church is trying very hard among canonists and theologians, looking at the applicability of these rights within the church's internal sphere. And Father Corridon believes that the church gradually realised that it must not only teach and preach on social justice and human rights to the world at large, but it must put them into practice in its own backyard. The most recent interaction of the Holy See with the UN treaty monitoring agencies that I referred to earlier, this gives rise for really serious concern. In recent years, the United Nations treaty monitoring committees, but especially the Committee on the Rights of the Child, have discussed a number of issues of, you might say, contention and indeed embarrassment to the Holy See. It's raised the issues of corporal punishment, which is still justified by the Church's teaching. You won't find it in canon law, but you will find it in the Catholic Catechism. And it won't use the word corporal punishment, but it will use the words taken from the book of Sirach, which we translate nowadays as spare the rod and spoil the child. So corporal punishment, illegitimacy, a status that still exists in canon law, sex education, the role of women, homosexuality, clerical abuse scandals, Magdalene, laundries, forced adoptions, and a whole litany of stuff. And until recent years, the Holy See indicated in its discourse with these, with the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and indeed with the other UN treaty agencies, it indicated three very important things. One, the Vatican City State was a mere workplace where implementation of the treaties did not arise and was not relevant. For example, in the case of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, Convention on the Rights of the Child, for most of its discourse with the CRC, it said the issue of children doesn't arise in the Vatican City State. And therefore the issue of implementing the treaty doesn't arise there. Secondly, they said the Holy See was implementing the convention, that is the Holy See in its international global sense, was implementing the convention in and through canon law and church teaching. That is said in a number of reports, quite a number of reports, to the CERD and to the CRC. Huge big headline, implementation, followed by a whole list of canons and teachings that have been brought into line with the treaties. And the third thing is that they said in 2 documents, which they sent, two rounds of negotiation or dialogue with the Committee on the Rights of the Child, they referred to the Pontifical Council for the Family as the body within the Curia charged with the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But as the engagement with the CRC went from relatively bland discussions to, in more recent times, very pointed and difficult discussions on difficult and issues of embarrassment to the Church, a clear change of tack emerged. And it told the Committee on the Rights of the Child in its most recent dialogue or discussion that as a spiritual entity, the Holy See has no obligation to implement the Convention within church teaching or canon law, and that all previous references to implementation were a mistake. It says that the Pontifical Council for the Family does not have a role in implementing the Convention, and all previous mentions were a mistake. The implementation requires, they now say, a territory, and it has discovered 36 children in the Vatican City State, and it now accepts, I don't know where they came from incidentally, but and you're not entitled to speculate either, and but it has discovered 36 children in the Vatican City State, and it now accepts that it must implement in that territory, because it accepts that the Vatican City State is indeed a state, and it is a state party. And therefore, in the summer of 2013, it changed a number of laws to bring them into line, in the Vatican City State, to bring them into line with the Convention. But it says that as far as, so it's happy to implement the Convention for 36 children, but not for children who are members of the Church. Does anybody in this audience have the faintest idea how many child members there are of the Catholic Church? Somewhere between 300 and 400 million child members of the Catholic Church. It went on to say that it accepted that it had discussed, and indeed it itself had raised issues to do with canon law and church teaching, unprovoked, unsolicited. It had raised, for example, the issue of homosexuality. It had raised the issue of women. But it said that in doing so, these were outside the jurisdiction of the committee, and that the Holy See raised them solely on a goodwill basis. This was news to the Committee on the Rights of the Child. It was hearing this for the first time in 25 years of the Holy See being a state party. And the CRC rejects this view out of hand. It flatly contradicts the view of the Holy See. And that, unfortunately, is where matters now stand, in a standoff between the Holy See and the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And it seems to me that much of the dialogue, the future dialogue or discourse on human rights is likely to begin to develop in this particular forum around the rights of children. And much will depend on the tenor of future debates. The Holy See, with somewhere between 300 and 400 million child members, 200,000 schools worldwide, in which 60 million children are educated. It is the biggest NGO in the world, bar none, in terms of servicing the needs of children, whether it's education or welfare or healthcare. In terms of its schools, the vast majority of children are not Catholic in those schools. So it serves a very, very wide body of children, and consequently is a very important player for the Committee on the Rights of the Child, because very few other agencies have the reach into the lives of children or influence the lives of children in the way that the Catholic Church does as the biggest single NGO in the world. So it seems to me both the Holy See and the Committee on the Rights of the Child have a vested interest in keeping this dialogue going on whatever terms. That would work for the benefit of children worldwide. So it's very important that the dialogue continue. The Holy See's last report was due last September, but it has not been lodged. That's nothing to get excited about. Many people are late with reports. The Holy See was 12 years late with its last report. For reasons that are pretty obvious. Wilfrid Quiroga and Gallavotti, who are writing in this field now, say that canon law, in terms of human rights, is at a crossroads. The Church's sovereignty, they say, over its own spiritual and juridic realm has not changed, but the world of internationally recognised human rights in which it operates now impinges upon it in ways it did not when the 1983 Code of Canon Law was promulgated. As they point out, during this period, confronting the actual life experience of the people of God has brought to light now several critical questions that demand revision, abrogation, amendment. And that includes now the dynamic of international human rights. They argue, Kirschlager, for example, he argues for a new hermeneutic of human rights within canon law and in the teaching of canon law. And he believes there's a need for canon law to be brought more closely into line with that which the Church advocates itself, its own advocacy on behalf of human rights. And he goes on to say a very telling phrase, that at stake is the credibility of the mission for which it was founded. And so I think that's where I should leave it, and leave it to you to ask whether that's an appropriate summary or summation. Like I say, the bird travelled high, fast, and at altitude. But I hope that it's given you some perspective on Catholic social teaching and human rights, and probably a perspective too on my perspective on that. Thank you very much.
Well, we shall let Professor McAleese gather her breath and wet her whistle. There will be opportunities later from the ambassador and from my colleague Karen Sanders, both to respond and to thank Professor McAleese for what I think we all agree was a fascinating lecture, and the tension at the centre of it was just brilliantly phrased, I think. Stepping either side would have been very, very difficult, I thought, but now here we go to your questions. I thought it perfectly balanced. So there are some microphones, I think, roving microphones in the audience, and so that we pick up, we can all hear your questions. If you do have questions, we have a little time for them, so where shall we start? Down here then. Thank you very much. And microphone's on its way, sir.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I was baptised on the day I was born. Effectively, I nearly died in the hospital. Therefore, I should declare an interest. It seems to me that if you're a lawyer, you ask the question, well, what is the damage to this baby who was baptised with no detailed knowledge about the Catholic Church into a Catholic Church whose overriding principle in canon law is the saving of souls? And had I died on that first day of life, I would be in paradise now. So I can't see where the complaint is.
Oh, that's pretty simple. I don't have any problem. I'm not complaining about that aspect. You might remember I said the theological consequences are not problematic in my view at all. They are gratuitous. And they did exactly as you said. They absolved you from original sin because, of course, the Church's teaching is such that a child who dies unbaptized cannot be guaranteed eternal salvation. That is the Church's teaching. It merely hopes that a generous God might admit the child to paradise, but the teaching of the Church right up to modern times is that it cannot guarantee. The child dies unbaptized, actually unlike somebody who's a catechumen. Somebody who's going through the catechumenate it can actually, and who dies before baptism, can have baptism by desire. But a child, a baby, an infant cannot. And I think that's a very big question if we're getting into what canon law could and should do for children. That's a really major lacuna. But I don't have any problem with infant baptism. I think infant baptism is exactly, it's a very beautiful thing. And the idea of gratuitous graces and opening the child, if there's any doubt at all that God might, dispatch the child to some other place other than heaven, though frankly I have difficulty with that kind of a God, but let's say it possible, and that's my Church's teaching, then as a parent, I absolutely in those circumstances would have baptized my child, and all three of my children are baptized anyway without that pressure. But that's the gratuitous gift of God. But canon law then enters the story and imposes on that child lifelong membership of a church with a bunch of obligations. Now let me just give you an example. When my children are born, I enroll them in the best golf club in Ireland, of which there are 450, and the most expensive. And for 18 years I pay their fees. And then on their 18th birthday, to their shock and horror, they get a bill from the club, which I now expect them as adults to pay. And the club says, well, you're life members, your parents set up this contract for life membership. And the kids, aren't they perfectly entitled to say, well, let me just look at that contract and ask the question, how valid is it? Because in the civil law, a civil court will look at onerous contracts entered into on behalf of children and will ask if the obligations are too onerous to render it a valid contract, or if they are so onerous that a child must be given the opportunity, when it is fully sentient, to either accept or reject such a contract. So I'll take that back to the canonical, the juridic consequences of baptism, and I'm asking the question, is the christening contract not the theological gift from God? Leave that aside, because that's a wonderful grace and it is a gift, and it flows ex opere operato Christi. It operates no matter what we do. It operates in our lives no matter what we do. But the other doesn't. When we go to school as young Catholics, we enter a catechesis of obligation, not invitation. Because by the time we come out of that church baptized, we are now owners of obligations, and they will follow us and track us for life.
Thank you. Now, I think the Vice-Chancellor would like to pose a question. And I think we might as well stay down here with the microphone, because we have a couple of other speakers down here who would like to ask questions.
Chair, I do have a question, but I just want to follow on very quickly. And as you know, Mary, I'm not a lawyer, so maybe I'm coming at this simply as a believer. Does the renewal of baptismal promises that I and every other believer engages in every Holy Saturday night at the Vigil or on Easter Sunday morning, is that not the adult acquiescence? And are there not other examples in relation to the trust that a parent or the godparent, until I become cognizant of certain things where I have to reaffirm as an adult, is there not a legal framework where law entrusts onto the guardians or the parents certain things? And therefore, I'm just wondering, as a believer, as I was listening to you, and I'm not a lawyer nor a canon lawyer, and I can see your point, but then I'm thinking on a personal level, I'm very conscious every Easter that I'm invited to renew my baptismal promises. Is that not a choice that I can reject? So if I'm not there, I'm not going to be in the invitation, but even for every believer, they're invited to renew that as an adult. Now, if I may, Chair, just very quickly, on the sovereignty issue, you mentioned the distinction of the sovereignty. And I'm wondering, with the UN aspect and the rights of the child, but also the Human Rights Committee in Geneva, that the form of sovereignty that the Holy See claims and the form of sovereignty enshrined in the Vatican City State are two very different types of sovereignty. Now, I'm not sure, with the ambassador present, I'm not sure that Ireland's diplomatic relations with the Holy See, I can't remember whether they predate or come after the Lateran Treaty, but this country's predate. So this country's sovereign recognition is for the Holy See, which is a form of sovereignty that's very rare now. The nearest equivalent we would have to it here would be something like the Crown. But in an era where sovereignty rests now in nation states, that's where the Vatican aspect kicks in. It's very complex, and certainly I know there's one person in the audience this evening that was a lawyer in the Foreign Office, and I remember trying to bring the Foreign Office lawyers through this. But I wonder, is that something that creates the confusion, and therefore the Holy See's response in distinguishing the sovereignty that rests at the Holy See is quite different from a territorial sovereignty that rests with the Vatican City State?
Okay, let me just take the first of those, the renewal of baptismal promises. Some people think that confirmation, the sacrament of confirmation, which actually where you use that phrase to renew baptismal promises, is the adult, the sentient person adopting, if you like, the membership of the church. It is not. Canonically, there is no opportunity to renege on church membership. If you renege on church membership, you commit a canonical offence. So it's the phraseology even to renew suggests that at some stage, you actually made that commitment and now you are renewing that commitment. But of course, a non-sentient child never made it in the first place. It was made for and on behalf of that child. Now, in a discussion about this very thing at the Committee on the Rights of the Child back in 1995, a delegate on behalf of the Holy See, in just exploring this particular question, said, look, the Holy See believes that a parent, just to take your point about the parent and education and guardianship, because nobody argues that parents the right to baptise their child. A parent has the right to raise their child in the faith. A parent has the right to share their faith with the child and to give them the value system that they believe, to offer them the value system they believe to be an important component of a good and happy life, followed by salvation, eternal salvation. But the Holy See delegate said to the Committee on the Rights of the Child that the Holy See's view was that parents had the right to guide and to support and to direct, but not to impose their faith. Now, this was completely and utterly incorrect. And unfortunately, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, it takes what's said to it by state parties very often at face value, because these are governments of the world. This is the Holy Catholic Church talking. So if the delegate tells you that, you believe it. It doesn't have the resources to go checking, every I and every T. That was incorrect. It is not what canon law says. Canon law says something quite different. When you're baptized, you become a member for life. The obligation never leaves you. Even if you walk away from the church, which is your absolute right in human rights law, that is not your right in the church's law. And my view is now that church law really needs to be more sensitive to the realities of the world that we're living in today. That imposition is not that imposition is exactly what it says on the tin, imposition, and that what we want really are Catholics who embrace the faith voluntarily, who embrace it not because they were obliged by baptismal obligations entered into 2 days, 2 weeks, 1 year, whatever, but rather exactly as you say, people who stand up and renew those promises and who are free to not renew them if they so wish. That's not canon law's current understanding, regrettably. But I think that's the kind of discourse that we need to get involved in. To take up the second point about the Vatican City State, actually, I think I don't think it really matters when, yes, of course, the Vatican City State was created in 1929, but As my understanding of it is that the ambassador, for example, from Ireland, as from Britain, is not an ambassador to the Vatican City State, but is an ambassador to the Holy See. The Holy See, as an international sovereign entity, long predates the Lateran Treaties. I mean, it's an entity that goes back into the mists of time, and has always been, and indeed, as you would expect, of an entity that had 1,000 years of secular power. Of course, it had its diplomats and it had its diplomatic corps. So no, I think the sovereignty of the Vatican City State is subsumed into the overall sovereignty of the Holy See, because the work of the Vatican City State, or the responsibility for it, is only a tiny, tiny microscopic corner of the work of the Holy See globally. It's only a tiny part. And indeed the sovereign of the Vatican City State is the Pope. I mean, if you look on its website, it describes itself, as a monarchy, and he is literally as a monarchy, and he is the monarch. So no, I don't think there's a problem there. I think that the sovereignty, I think the difficulty is that having never drawn attention for 25 years to the territoriality that distinguished the Vatican City State, the state party obligations of the Vatican City State from the state party obligations of the Holy See, having failed to do that for 25 years, and doing it now when it's under pressure in terms of the scandals, I think the cynicism and the scepticism of the Committee on the Rights of the Child is well-founded. I regret to say that, and I regret to say that, having studied every full stop and comma of every document sent by the Holy See to the various committees, I'm persuaded that sometime in the 2000s a change of plan took place. Now, it's not without coincidence that the only country on the planet which has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child is one which would be very influential in terms of church thinking on this issue, and that is the United States of America. So I can't put it any stronger than that, but I do think that there has been a manifest change of tack, and regrettably it is not supported by the Church's own documentary evidence, which was submitted freely and voluntarily by them to the Committee on the Rights of the Child. I mean, it's a matter of embarrassment to me as a Catholic. And there are a number of egregious errors in the documentation supplied by the Holy See to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which speak of, what would you say, maybe a slipshoddiness, really, in its discourse. And to some extent that might explain all the mistakes they made all over the years. But I think the Committee on the Rights of the Child is well within its rights to say, hang on a minute, how come you're telling us this 25 years later?
Thank you. Now we have another question there from, I think, Christopher Moran and then Jacob Phillips. So if we can do that. Thank you. Just here, second row. Yes, indeed.
Thank you very much. I want to put to you that I think there's a problem in what you've said tonight in terms of what we really understand by human rights, and this is articulated as it happens in the wreath lectures that are going on at the moment by Jonathan Sumption, the former Justice of the UK Supreme Court. I think the problem is this: you can talk in one sense about the great human rights movement, 1948, the Universal Declaration, fundamental human rights, core human rights, and you can claim for that great emotional, legal, political, and spiritual resonance. That's fine, but I think the problem arises when you then have a very expansive interpretation and development of new rights, and you touched on this a bit by talking about rights being unenumerated or inherently embedded, though not expressly articulated. And the problem is this, that unless you just have a very vague concept of human rights, you look at the instruments that you mentioned, the Universal Declaration, and then the treaties which followed, which articulate in articles, in legal terms, a series of obligations and rights. And that's what states sign up to. That's what they're examined on by the treaty monitoring bodies. What has happened is that, as well as the kind of, I'd say, a legitimate interpretation of those articles in the course of the passage of time, you have a tendency to I'll say, create completely new rights that go beyond a legitimate parameter of legal interpretation, and that what's happened is that committees tend to be activists. People who are elected to them tend to be activists. They want to develop. They think it's right to develop new rights, and they don't see why they shouldn't. Well, okay, but the problem then is the resonance you claim for human rights is diluted if the rights themselves become very extensive, and you've mentioned whole categories of rights which are not expressed in the treaties. I don't think you can claim the same resonance for everything which is claimed to be right and expect the Catholic Church and canon law to amend itself to comply with that extended interpretation of rights. If you can't have it both ways. You can have a supremely important concept of human rights to which states, including the Holy See, must comply, or you can have a much more elastic interpretation to suit whatever anybody's particular cause is, but then you lose something of that resonance.
Not sure I agree with where you're going. I actually don't know of any completely new rights. Can you name one of them?
Well, I suppose you can either have a new right. I mean, the example given is the interpretation of Article 8 of the European Convention on Privacy and Family Life to really encompass a whole range of different situations, covering all sorts of aspects of, private, all aspects of, I suppose, sexual behaviour, but much more than that. I mean,
would you call that new rights? I mean, or
yeah,
are they just developments?
Well, I think. Well,
look at the text. I mean, the text talks about a right to privacy. That's a very, very, very terse statement that requires to be unpacked. That's why we have courts. That's why we have the committees to unpack what's a very terse statement. What does that mean? Does it mean that that anybody who takes a photograph of me on the street invades my privacy? Can I vindicate that right? Those are so. I'm not entirely sure that I agree. I don't honestly know of any completely new rights that have been invented by any of the committees. I can't think of any. I can think of some that have been developed. I think of terse statements and I can think of some that have been developed to in ways that I think have been humanly great. For example, take the issue of corporal punishment, where I think the Church is way out of step now. In my the Holy See subscribed to a treaty which says that children are entitled to their bodily integrity. That's what it says. But the interpretation of that is that corporal punishment, which traditionally was normative in many jurisdictions, including my own, including here, is we've moved in a direction of beginning to understand what bodily integrity means, and we now realise and accept that even parental use and even the reasonable use of what we would have used to call in the past reasonable chastisement, that is no longer acceptable.
Could I just say, I mean, two obvious examples which Lord Sumption talks about a lot are the classic, the right to abortion, the right to assisted suicide, which is proclaimed by some, is being argued in courts in this country. So if you take, I suppose, those examples, yes, you can say they're developments of the right to life, ironically, but everything can come under one umbrella heading or another. But in substance, in essence, they're sort of new rights, I suppose.
Well, these are for discourse. I mean, they are for debate. When we're talking about things that are characterised in very terse terms, and indeed the Code of Canon Law does the same thing, with heresy and schism, for example, and apostasy. These are, very short little definitions that require to be expanded upon in discourse and in dialogue. But I can think of a number of areas where, and I think illegitimacy is another example, where the Church has changed tack very, very substantially from the old code, for example, clearly influenced by the world around us. In the old code, a person applying to become a priest would have required a special dispensation if they were illegitimate. A bishop couldn't become a bishop, couldn't be appointed bishop if they'd been born illegitimately. And a lot of those old attitudes and perspectives disappeared in the 1983 code, but regrettably, the status of illegitimacy did not. And nor does the Church, in the Code of Canon Law, state that illegitimate children are to be regarded on an equal basis with legitimate children. In fact, it says something quite different. So they're put under pressure by the Committee on the Rights of the Child to explain that, particularly when they have signed up to a document in international law in which they have entered no reservation in this regard. They did enter a couple of reservations, but not in this regard. And they are being asked, well, how come your teaching then is different from what you advocate? And so I think that this kind of discourse created in Ireland, for example, a big debate around the use of the defence of reasonable chastisement by parents in the case of the use of corporal punishment of children. It's only 2 years ago that our law changed that, and we did that as a result of that discussion, that debate that was initiated by becoming a state party to the convention, continued through all the dialogue, all the NGOs in Ireland and the various constituencies, whether it's teachers, whether it's parents, all engaging in a debate out of which they begin to think, we have to think again about this issue, because we've now established a principal human right that is the right to bodily integrity. And if we're to be consistent with that, and if we're in particular, if we're to be consistent with the gospel of a loving God, in the case of the Church, do we really want to continue a tradition that is essentially biblical but not New Testament? They had to go back to the book of Sirach to get the wording that justifies that. There's nothing in the New Testament, that justifies corporal punishment. So, this is debate. This is the kind of debate that I think is wonderful to have. And it's why also in the talk I concentrated largely on areas like freedom of conscience, freedom of belief, freedom of religion, freedom to change religion, because they have a specificity about them. Unlike, they're not just as terse as some of the others, or as difficult to interpret.
What a fascinating question. And I think we'll now move to our last question to our head of the Institute of Theology, Jacob Phillips.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. And I want to go back to the infant baptism point, I'm afraid. I'm not a lawyer or a canon lawyer, but I think there are potential dangers, at the least, to this idea that one can untangle what you were calling the juridical aspects to the provision on infant baptism from the spiritual or theological. In your answer to the first question there, and your articulation of understanding infant baptism sola gratia, or in terms of grace alone, it seemed to me you were aligning almost perfectly with some of the theologies which were around at the time of the Reformation. Essentially the idea that grace or one's spiritual status can be untangled from a set of concrete obligations to a specific institution which considers itself uniquely mandated to demand those obligations. And I think to do so, to untangle those two, and to separate the spiritual from the earthly, or grace from nature, or faith from works, there's a very strong rationale for doing it, but one is treading on very, very contested territory theologically in suggesting one should do so. And then secondly, I think underneath all of this, there's a whole discussion to be had about relationship. I mean, you mentioned filial obedience. And by sticking the word filial in there, there's a particular type of relationship which is being held, for the relation between the believer and the church is being held as the primary analogy, and that's the relationship between a parent and child. Now, of course, a child can walk away from their parents. Of course, a child cannot honour, as an adult, cannot honour the concrete obligations they owe, if you want to put it in that language, to the institution of the family. But the parents still remain parents. They're estranged parents, and the child is estranged. The most fundamental relationship in human life is not voluntary. Do I feel that my parents impose themselves on me by being my parents? No.
Thank you. So, fascinating.
Right. I absolutely no idea where the notion of estrangement comes from. So I'm just not going to go there, because I really have no idea what you're talking about. Frankly, the idea that if a child decides not to, are you saying that if a child decides not to follow the faith of its parents, that it becomes automatically estranged from the parents?
No, I was saying if one thinks that there's an analogy made in theological language about the relationship between the believer and the church being analogous to the relationship between a child and its parents, as an adult, the child can of course walk away from their parents, but the language we use does not deny that the parents remain the parents. They become the estranged parents. And that's the analogy which is there in the theological tradition.
The filial relationship that we owe to God is a different matter from the filial relationship that might be owed, for example, to our sacred pastors. And that's where the problem arises here. Let me just take a very simple example. I'm talking about obligations like, for example, the obligation to confess sins, which are imposed on all members of the Catholic Church. Under canon law, we're obliged to confess our grave sins at least once a year. And that's an obligation that kicks in when a person reaches what's called the age of discretion. And the age of discretion is thought to be about the same time in church teaching as the use of reason, which is around the age of 7. That has never been, nobody's ever looked at that again. Nobody has ever said whether or not that, in the light of modern science or modern understanding, never to mind the law, leaving aside the law, is it right to impose, by what right do we impose that obligation on 7-year-olds? When you get to 7 and you suddenly discover, oops, I have this obligation now. It arises by virtue of my baptism. By virtue of my baptism. And the question I'm asking is, that obligation could be changed tomorrow by canon law. So it doesn't have any deep theological significance, actually. It's simply a rule that is negotiable, because it's been negotiable all over the years. I mean, that particular formal rule of the annual confession. You know, look at the history of confession. You know, it has moved from sackcloth and ashes through the medieval era, right the way to thanks to St. Columcille, or St. Columbanus rather, the great Irishman, to auricular confession as we know it today. So these are rules. These are man-made rules, and it's the man-made rules that I am asking questions about. Not the theological, not that which you can direct back to the filial obedience that we owe to God, but I'm asking the question, by what right do we impose on the non-sentient these obligations and insist that when they become sentient, they remain committed to them, even when they don't wish to be? That's my problem. And it is a problem with canon law, and I accept that there are probably very few canon lawyers in the room, but the truth of the matter is that membership of the church is underpinned by canon law, mandated by canon law. And the consequences, the obligations are set out there. Many of us go through life not fully aware of them, regrettably. And maybe it's about time we did become aware of them, because within them, that clash between what's there and the rights of the human person in a rights literate community, for example, like Ireland, where many people are now walking away from the church, and the church writes about them in terms of, really in terms of apostasy, of being overwhelmed by a tide of secularism, instead of just saying, actually, they're entitled to if they want to. They're perfectly entitled to go.
I think it's the mark, the eternal mark of an excellent lecture, that A, you get splendid questions, and B, the chair has to stop the questions. And I am going to do that now, because I'm going to call on my colleague, Professor Karen Saunders, who's Dean of Research at St. Mary's, to respond to that excellent lecture. Over to you, Karen.
So, good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. I first of all want to thank Professor McAleese, Mary, if I may.
Please.
Yeah. For what's been a really substantial, absolutely fantastically interesting and thought-provoking lecture. I really love listening to you, and I wish we could go on, but we can't, so there we are. So, in preparation for today's lecture, I wrote to Mary last week to see if I could get some advance notice of what she was going to speak about. And she sent me an extract, really fascinating extract from her doctoral thesis, which is on children's rights and obligations in canon law. So I can attest to the detailed, rigorous work that Mary has done in this field. And I actually checked some of those things you were mentioning, because I was taken aback by the corporal punishment reference, but you're absolutely right, there it is in the Catechism. So I can't obviously, there's so much richness in what we've heard tonight, so I'm going to focus on 3 points. The first one is to underline what I believe to be the invaluable and intellectually and morally courageous service Mary has performed in shining a light on the Church's own record in the area of human rights, and in particular children's human rights, and their articulation within the Church's own legal framework, the Code of Canon Law. She's asked us to think about how these rights and obligations are treated and framed, and I think especially in relation to our infant and junior Catholics, this is really a very important question, especially in the light of the terribly difficult questions posed by the child sex abuse cases. I think Professor McAleese has been rigorous, and I would argue fair-minded, in highlighting the light and shade in the Church's record. She's pointed out that the Church is the world's largest non-governmental provider of services, educational services and welfare to children, Catholics and non-Catholics alike. And the Catholic Church has a proud record in this area. She also shows and writes about in her doctoral thesis about how canon law was an early tool for the championing of children's rights. In your own words, exactly. Mary, you talk about how long before the 20th century claimed to have invented the idea of the child as a holder of autonomous rights, canon law had already done so. So you quite rightly draw attention to that. You already in your lecture drew attention to the fact that the Holy See was the fourth state party to sign and ratify the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. However, you have also alerted us, and you do so very clearly in your work, to the threadbare state of the analysis of children's rights and obligations in canon law, notwithstanding outstanding work in other areas. And to quote somebody you quote, childhood studies within the Catholic Church are very much in their infancy. So I think that today, and in the work you're doing, you're laying down a necessary challenge to clarify inconsistencies and anomalies in the way children's rights, and not just children's rights, are approached. So I would congratulate Mary for that work. I see it as prophetic. My second point is related to a more general discussion of the Catholic tradition's relationship to the development of the doctrine of human rights. We know, and you've highlighted, that the Catholic Church has a rich, vibrant record in thinking and in acting upon human rights, especially to the external sphere. And it's also true, as you highlighted, and the moral theologian Professor Ronheimer explains, that it was only with the Second Vatican Council that the Catholic Church fully acknowledged the positive value of the modern idea of autonomous human rights. However, I think there are two things we should, in justice to the Catholic Church, highlight in their contribution to establishing the idea of autonomous human rights in the contemporary world. First, the Christian tradition and its key insight into the dualism of spiritual and temporal power made possible the very idea of a secular state, in part, and also, in part, provided the resources that contributed to the notion of human rights. And I think it's only just to recognise that. And secondly, there is a rich tradition of thinking, Christian thinking, about human rights, which I think is often neglected by the Anglo-American world. And here I'm showing my cultural bias. I lived for many years in Spain and in Peru. I worked on Hispanic intellectual history. And I think perhaps this makes me a bit sensitive to ethnocentric biases in telling the stories about our past. Spain's encounter with America and its civilizations in the 15th century gave rise to deep thought about the natural rights of human beings. Scholars such as Francisco de Vitoria, Domingo de Soto y Martín de Azpilicueta emphasized liberty and natural rights in a way which was totally untypical in 16th and 17th century Europe. The scholars of the School of Salamanca, as they were known, and I believe the ambassador and his wife, that one of their first postings was in Madrid, and your children were in Salamanca, so beautiful city, wonderful intellectual hothouse at this time. They argued that as all humans share the same nature, they also share the same rights to life and liberty. This kind of thinking ran directly counter to the prevailing views in Europe that American indigenous people did not have such rights, and we shouldn't forget this contribution. So finally, I just wish to make a suggestion. Professor McAleese, you are incredibly inspirational. You have made us very aware that the area of children's rights and obligations as members of the Church is currently rather overlooked within the Catholic Academy. You also have pointed out that courses leading to pontifical professional qualifications in canon law do not provide core subject teaching on children's rights or on the Holy See's obligations under multilateral international treaties. Now, we know we have with Reverend Dr. Ashley Beck's MA in Catholic Social Teaching, a wonderful MA here offered by St. Mary's. It is part of the offering of the Institute of Theology, which Dr. Jacob Phillips leads, one of the now leading theological departments in the country. So I'm thinking, and we should not also forget to mention our canon lawyer specialist, Dr. Sister Helen Costigan. So I'm thinking that maybe St. Mary's is the place to take up Professor McAleese's challenge, and we would be looking to you for inspiration and support as we develop work in that area, I hope. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
And if I could now call upon the Ambassador, Adrian O'Neill, to give a vote of thanks. So, wherever you care to.
Oh, cool. Don't be lazy.
I thought I'd sit here so you could get up there easily.
Well, good evening. Good evening, everybody. You can hear me? Yeah. Good evening. Well, like Karen, I just want to, on behalf of all of us, express our sincere appreciation for a wonderful lecture by Mary, and in terms of its erudition and its eloquence and clarity of expression was phenomenal, and I enjoyed it very much. I wasn't surprised by all of those qualities. In a former life, I had the honour of being Secretary General to the President for 18 months, the final 18 months, I think, of Mary's 14-year tenure in that role. And like all of my diplomatic colleagues in the Department of Foreign Affairs, we always held Mary, and indeed Martin, her husband, in the highest regard and respect for the work that they had done on peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland, but also the way that Mary represented the country abroad with such immense dignity. And this evening, as I was kind of struggling to think what I could possibly say on the subject of Catholic social thought, I reached for a book that Mary actually gave to me and inscribed for me on her last day in office, on the 10th of November 2011. And it's Building Bridges, which is selected speeches from her 14-year presidency. And Building Bridges was, of course, the theme of her presidency. And I opened the book, and I had forgotten that the foreword to the book was written by a great friend of Mary and Martin, the late Seamus Heaney. And I just looked for some inspiration from Seamus, as I often do. And he says in the foreword very early on, speaking about Mary's inauguration speech in her first term, that she announced that her theme would be building bridges. At the time, the phrase could have been taken as a decent metaphor and a pious aspiration. But 14 years on, it stands out as an expression of courageous resolve and a summary of historic achievement. Well, I think this evening, in what Mary had to say, we saw great further examples of that courageous resolve. And then subsequently he says, talking about the hundreds of engagements, perhaps thousands of engagements over that 14 years that Mary fulfilled, and the many speeches that she would have made. He says, at almost every one of those official engagements, and on others less formal, the President had to speak or make a speech. But in her case, the difference was only one of length between brief, unscripted remarks and a fully fledged oration. The same substance, conviction, comprehension, and passionate utterance were in evidence every time. And indeed, we saw them again this evening. So thank you, Mary.
Well, it is our tradition on such occasions to provide our distinguished lecturer with a gift, and I think we have one. If we can bring it down, thank you. Right. Just a little something. No, thank you.
The entire Chelsea flower show about.
Indeed, indeed.
Thank you.
And I can't, before I give way so that we can circulate and enjoy some refreshments and perhaps talk with our distinguished lecturer, I have, on behalf of St Mary's, to thank Father Gimleys and the University of Notre Dame here in London for, well, almost everything, for their hospitality, their friendship. We won't mention sport because I think they won the last two occasions. So, but Father Jim and the community here have been so welcoming to us and such a help. And I'd just like to perhaps ask Father Jim to sort of finish off this part of the evening for us. So over to you.
Well, as grateful as John may be, we are at Notre Dame hugely grateful to Francis Campbell and the collaboration that's been created between St. Mary's University in Twickenham and our institution. And to Father Ashley Beck, who's on our faculty, but also offers the master's program in Catholic social teaching here. It means a lot to us to partner with him and with those who come here and study here. And finally, to Mary, we're grateful to have you. You're a blessing on our house. She may be a former president, but her erudition and her articulation of knowledge and learning rivals even that of my own current president.
That's jam with faint praise.
What did you do to it? I would like to offer, as we do at our place, just a little prayer of gratitude to God and a blessing on this house and our going forward. Oh God, fill the hearts of those who have joined us this day with the zeal that Mary McAleese articulates, that we might live lives of purpose, lives of courage and compassion, thinking not first of ourselves, but of our children and of human rights, and of those who are most in need, those for whom Jesus asked us to give particular attention and care. As representatives, many of us of St. Mary's University in Twickenham and the University of Notre Dame, we ask you, O God, to look after all of our students and bless them with all the blessings that you can muster. And finally, O God, bless every member of the administration, faculty, and staff of our respective institutions, whose wit and wisdom and every effort make possible all that our students take away from their time with us. May all who have given their lives and their work to the mission and ministry of our institutions continue to be a source of inspiration and transformation for all who find their way to us. For the many for whom it matters so much, O God, may there always be a desire and a passion in our efforts to make you, in the words of the founder of the Congregation of Holy Cross, Blessed Basil Moreau, to make you known loved, and served. May we continue to work together to educate the mind and the heart of every member of our respective communities and work together to build your kingdom on earth. We ask this in your holy name, O God, through Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you, one and all. There'll be refreshments served in the back of the room.
Lovely.
There.
Thank you.
Now you can